session. So I'm going to present Are We There Yet? And this is a joint work with Avichai Cohen, Amir Herzberg, Michael Schapira, and Haya Shulman. And this talk is really focused on RPKI, its deployment and security properties. So let me start with a clear and brief reminder of what RPKI is. So the resource public key infrastructure, or the RPKI, maps networking objects, and specifically I'm going to focus on IP prefixes to the organizations that own them. And RPKI is really intended to do two things. So the first one is to prevent prefix and subprefix hijacks. And the second one is to lay the cryptographic foundation for protection against more sophisticated path manipulation attacks on interdomain routing. And specifically, it lays the cryptographic foundation and the keying mechanisms behind BGP-sec. So let me just quickly remind what prefix and subprefix hijacks are. So assume we have one legitimate origin for a prefix, AS3320, and that AS announces its prefix 91.0/10 to ASY. So now ASY learns a route to the IP addresses within that prefix and sends its traffic there. And also forwards that advertisement on to ASX, of course, appending its own identifier to the route. So now ASX learns some route to this prefix, but the attacker at AS666 announces the same prefix. So now ASX had learned two routes, and it needs to choose. And let's say that ASX chooses using the shortest path rule. So now traffic flows to AS666 instead of the legitimate owner of the prefix. To demonstrate subprefix hijacks, I've moved ASY to the other side of the graph. So the legitimate owner still announces its prefix, and it reaches ASX. And now AS666 announces a subprefix of that, so a /16, a more specific prefix. ASY sends its traffic there and also relays that to ASX. And now ASX learns a route to the prefix and a route to the subprefix. And traffic to the subprefix follows the longest prefix match rule. So in fact, the path length here does not matter, and traffic will flow to the attacker. So how does RPKI prevent that? Well, RPKI certifies ownership over IP prefixes. So to do that, it assigns an IP prefix to a public key through a resource certificate or an RC. For now, let's assume that these RCs cannot be forged and they are cryptographically signed by someone who's authorized to do so. I'm going to slightly talk about the chain of trust in RPKI later on. And then the owner who owns the private key that corresponds to the public key specified in the RC can now sign a route origin authorization record, or ROA, which is then published and is public domain, so everyone can know about it. And the ROA identifies the ASs who are authorized to advertise that prefix in BGP. So going back to my example, prefix 91.0/10 actually belongs to Deutsche Telekom, and they took some measures in order to protect their prefix, so they got certified by RIPE, the root of trust for the European domain, and they also used their RC to issue a ROA. So now there's a ROA that everyone should know about, protecting prefix 91.0/10. And the ROA also specifies a maximum length, which is the most specific prefix that Deutsche Telekom allows to announce for this prefix. And in this case, it is 10. So only that particular prefix is allowed. And the only origin that's allowed to announce it is AS3320. So how can this help to prevent prefix and subprefix hijacks? Going back to my example, now ASX knows about this ROA, so it knows that the only origin that's allowed to announce this prefix is 3320, And so it can identify that the attacker's prefix is actually the attacker's announcement is actually invalid, and so it can discard it, and traffic will flow in the correct direction to ASY and then to the legitimate owner at 3320. So in this talk, I'm going to divide the remainder of this talk to 3 parts. So the first one is going to be about the obstacles facing the deployment of RPKI, and I'm going to start about talking about insecure deployments. So really, like any other security mechanism, it allows a freedom of choice, and you might deploy it in an insecure manner. And specifically, I'm going to talk about what we call loose ROAs. So consider this similar topology now, where we have the legitimate owner at ASA, and that owner had advertised a ROA for its own prefix. So it has a ROA for its /16, and you can see that the ROA's maximum length allows precisely that the IP prefix to be published by ASA. So what can our attacker do? Well, it could try to circumvent the RPKI defense, and doing that by announcing. Oh wait, so ASA announces that, and our attacker can try to circumvent the RPKI defense by sort of announcing a false path to ASA. So in this case, the attacker sort of makes up a link to ASA, and now this advertisement looks valid according to the RPKI, because A is the actual origin that's specified in the advertisement, and that's the origin that's allowed by the RPKI. The maximum length is valid, and so ASX receives that advertisement too. And which way would it go? Well, it's likely to go with the shorter path. So still, traffic is likely to flow in the correct direction. And there have been actually extensive studies about that. And this attack is actually called the one-hop attack in the paper that I'm citing. And there it was shown to be much less effective than regular prefix hijacks. So I'm going to consider that as sort of a win for the RPKI. So that is a good thing that RPKI can achieve. But now consider the case where the maximum length is actually pretty permissive. So ASA, instead of writing 16 as the maximum length, actually specifies 24. So now the ROA is really loose. The ROA allows for advertising prefixes that are not being actually advertised by ASA. And well, our attacker can take advantage of that. So it would carry the exact same attack, except instead of the /16, it would say /24. And that means that according to the longest prefix match rule, the traffic will actually flow to the attacker at 666. So let me just say that this attack is also mentioned in RFC 7115 in one of the examples. And there it's mentioned as sort of an attack that's less likely to be noticed. But I actually want to emphasize that this attack is actually more likely to succeed, precisely because they attack a subprefix. So just to recap, why does this attack work? So we have the attacker at 666, and it claims to be a neighbor of ASA, but the RPKI does not provide any mechanism that allows to make sure that this is valid. ASA does not actually originate the prefix that the attacker targets, the /24. So the ROA is loose, but the ROA is loose and allows that. And finally, the longest prefix match rule ensures that for most ASs, the hijacker is actually going to get the traffic. And this is regardless of where it is located in the network. So how common are these insecure deployments? Well, it turns out they are pretty common. So around 30% of the prefixes that are covered by RPKI are actually sort of unprotected because of that. And about 89% of the prefixes with maximum length that's larger than the prefix length, so prefixes that are taking advantage of this maximum length property are actually vulnerable. So almost everyone who's taking advantage of it. And finally, I want to also point out that it actually manifests some large providers. So we've seen some really important organizations that have used a very permissive length in the ROAs. And this vulnerability is actually should be solved when BGP-sec is deployed, but we have a long time until then. So until then, we actually better not issue loose ROAs and use the maximum length that's required. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the human error factor. And it turns out that in the RPKI, there are many other mistakes that people have made. And specifically, there are bad ROAs, which can cause legitimate prefixes to appear as invalid if you're doing route origin validation according to the RPKI. And specifically, that might cause, for someone who's doing filtering, to disconnect from legitimate destinations. And there have been extensive measurements about that. So let me just point out that out of the about 6.5% of the prefixes that are covered, that are announced in BGP and are covered by the RPKI, about just over 8% are invalid. And another almost 30% are valid, but are actually unprotected because of these loose ROAs that I've shown you earlier. So we've also done a short anonymous survey for network operators in this work. And we've asked them what is the main concern regarding doing RPKI-based origin authentication in your network. And as you can see, a very important thing that was pointed out is actually being disconnected from destinations. So this is a true concern about RPKI used in practice. And so then we checked who are the organizations behind these bad ROAs. And so here on the plot, you can see on the x-axis the number of ROA issuers, and on the y-axis the fraction of errors that these ROAs cause. And what we found was actually some pretty good news, because it seems that only a few organizations are have actually issued the ROAs causing most of the problems. So we actually view this as very good news, because some focused effort and maybe some convincing for these guys might improve the integrity of the information in the RPKI quite a bit. And the last thing that I want to talk about in this part of the talk are inter-organizational dependencies. So there are two inter-organizational dependencies that RPKI sort of encapsulates. And the first one is a downward dependency, which is a dependency in issuing a ROA. So specifically consider the following scenario. There is an RIR who holds a root certificate for the domain. They have signed a certificate, an RC, for some provider with a /8. Now that provider, in the decades that it has this IP prefix, had sold parts of it to some customers. Now, as soon as that provider goes on and issues a ROA for its own IP prefix, it would make customer announcements that are not covered by ROAs to actually appear invalid. And the reason is that these customers will now be perceived as sort of sub-prefix hijackers, although they are the legitimate owners of the IP prefixes. So we've measured. So for how many prefixes and what portion of the IP address space there actually exists as dependencies. And what we've seen is, again, some good news. So this does not apply for a whole lot of organizations and IP prefixes. And as you can see here, most are not actually dependent. Some bad news that come with that is that those that are actually dependent are really important. So you can see here again a CDF, and the x-axis describes the number of organizations. The y-axis describes the fraction of downward dependencies either for prefixes or for the IP address space. And you can see that really most of the dependent IP address space belongs to just a few organizations, suggesting that their IP address space is quite large. And then the other side of these dependencies is the dependency in issuing a certificate. So now consider the following similar scenario. We have the same provider, but now that provider did not bother to get an RC. So the provider does not have an RC, but now its customers want to join the RPKI. So they need an RC, except the provider does not have an authorized key to sign their allocation. So this might be a deployment problem in practice, especially in case that this chain between the RIR who holds the RC in this case and the customers is quite long. The customers might try to go to the RIR and get them certified directly. There might be some challenges in practice in doing that. So this might be an issue. So we've also checked how many organizations are actually upward dependent. And again, some good news. It looks like not that much. So really the allocation tree is quite shallow. And again, here the x-axis describes the depth of the dependency. And you can see that for most, there's actually no dependency. So that's quite good. So now I'll talk about some mechanism that a system that we built to improve the information accuracy recorded in the RPKI. And so our system is called Raw Alert, and it has two sides to it. So one side is a web interface that's available at rawalert.org, which allows network operators to check whether their IP prefixes are properly protected by ROAs, and if not, why not. So if they have a loose ROA, that would indicate that. If the AS number is wrong, that would indicate that and would say what should the AS number be. And also, if they have too short of a maximum length for what is actually being announced, it would say that and say what would the maximum length be. And finally, if you consider the case that I've shown you earlier of a provider issuing a ROA causing its customer to be invalid, well, in that case, we would also indicate who the provider might be and what sort of ROA did it issue that causes the customer to be invalid. Now, the other side for the ROA alert system is a sort of an online and proactive notification system that alerts network operators about bad or loose ROAs. So we periodically retrieve the ROAs from the RPKI publication points and compare them against the BGP advertisements that we observe. And so we identify and we identify problems. So in case of a loose ROA, we would alert the operator, and in case of bad ROAs, we would also alert them. And sometimes the actual offender and victim are not the same organization. So in particular, that provider and customer case that I've shown you, in these cases, we would email both sides. And the email has a pretty descriptive description of the error. And indeed, we got some promising initial results. So our emails reached 168 victims and offenders. And within a month, we've checked what happened, and about 42% of these errors were actually fixed. And this is a significant rate, which we believe is optimistic. And just to clarify some of the differences of Raw Alert from other systems, it is constantly monitoring, so it's not just upon registration that you might get alerted, and also it's not an opt-in. So we constantly monitor and we alert whenever we see something that's bad. And so we really advocate that Raw Alert be adopted and adapted by more significant and less academic body than us. And so so far my talk has focused mostly about the information that's publicly available in the RPKI, and the ROAs. And now I'm going to shift a bit to the other side, sort of the other side of the RPKI, which is doing route origin validation. So I will show some first measurements that we have regarding doing route origin validation, and then I'm going to evaluate how good is RPKI and route origin validation under partial deployment. So let me first explain a bit what it means to do route origin validation according to the RPKI, and this slightly repeats previous talks, but bear with me, I'm sure you'd find it interesting. So in order to use the RPKI to do route origin validation, or ROV, the network administrator needs to set up a local general purpose machine that runs some software which syncs with the RPKI publication points. So it gets the RCs and ROAs from these publication points, and then it can actually validate that the signatures are correct. And for those records that are fine, it would create sort of a whitelist rules based on these ROAs, and then it would push them to the routers within the autonomous system. So really, as you can see, the changes to the routers are really minor, and this is a big differentiator from BGP-SEC. So really, major router vendors are actually supporting ROV today, and it has a very negligible overhead. So almost any AS anywhere can do ROV. So this is a fairly good start for a new security protocol. So now we're interested in knowing, is it actually being enforced? So I will now show part of our measurements which regard who's not doing ROV, and specifically in order to gain some empirical insights, we actually use invalid advertisements that already exist on the internet. So unfortunately, there are a lot of those using the RPKI, and that suffices for our study. And we monitor those invalid advertisements through the paths that are observed by the route view sensors. So this is a completely passive study, and let me just point out that there's currently an ongoing follow-up study which uses more advanced active techniques. So if you're interested in that, you might want to be on the look for that study when it finishes. So to our measurements. So consider the following topology where we have two origins, and each of them advertises a prefix that is invalid according to the RPKI. Now, in this set of measurements that I'll present, we're focusing specifically on the ASs that are not doing filtering. So we only care about those that do not discard invalid routes. And to see who these guys are, we simply observe the routes, the routes that the invalid advertisements take, and then we can point out that all the ASs that relay these advertisements are actually not doing filtering according to the RPKI. So what did we find? Well, we found that at least 80 out of the 100 largest ISPs do not do filtering according to the RPKI. And the reason that I'm presenting focused results on these 100 largest ISPs is dual. So both because for these particular ISPs, we can actually see a lot of paths that go through them. So using this passive approach, it's easier to learn about them. And the second one is, as I'm going to show you in the remainder of my talk, is that these guys turned out to be very important for the security benefits that RPKI can provide. So we've also asked that in our survey, do you apply RPKI-based route origin validation? And you can see that the numbers pretty much confirm what we've seen. So about 85% have answered no. about 10% have answered yes, but only to prefer invalid routes. And only about 5% have indicated that they use that in order to discard invalid advertisements. Now, let me just talk about these 10% who are doing depreference. Well, it was shown that depreference actually does not help at all against subprefix hijacks. And because in that case, you would only be informed of one prefix. So really, you don't have anything to deprefer it with, and so that AS would fall victim to the attack. And also, in case you only have one provider that connects you to the internet, well, you might only receive one advertisement for the prefix, and therefore, again, be fooled to take it. So as we've seen, deployment of ROV seems very partial. And so now the question is, how good is ROV under partial deployment? And what are the security benefits that we might expect to get from it under such deployment scenarios? And we identified two interesting collateral effects. So the first one is the collateral benefit effect, where adopters might be able to protect ASs behind them in the internet topology just by discarding invalid routes. So consider this simple topology. So we have the attacker at AS666 and the legitimate prefix owner at AS1, and the owner has a ROA published. So anyone who's doing ROV knows about this ROA. And in particular, consider AS2 who is doing ROV and AS3 who does not. So what's going to happen so let us assume that the attacker tries to do a subprefix hijack. Well, now the AS doing ROV at AS2 will actually discard that advertisement. And so when the origin advertises its own prefix, the /16, that advertisement will reach AS3, and therefore, since AS3 is only offered the good route, it will not be fooled, and traffic will actually flow in the right direction. So that is a pretty good effect that using ROV might have. Now let me talk about the collateral damaging effect that we've seen. So the collateral damage means that, in our context, means that ASs who are not doing ROV might actually cause damage to ASs who are doing ROV. So to demonstrate that, I've swapped AS2 and AS3. So now AS2 does not adopt and does not perform ROV, while AS3 does. And the first type of collateral damage that I'll show is disconnection. So by disconnection, let us consider the case where AS2 actually prefers to take to advertise a route from the attacker at 666 rather than a route from the origin. And now let's consider the case where the origin announces its prefix, the /16, and the attacker performs a prefix hijack. Well, in that case, AS2 will actually announce the bad route to AS3. And since AS3 is performing ROV, it will know to discard this route. And since it's not being offered any other route, it will be disconnected from the prefix 1.1/16. So in not adopting, AS2 had actually caused AS3 to disconnect. Okay, so you might say, well, disconnection is better than reaching the wrong AS. So I prefer not to send my traffic at all than actually having it reach the wrong destination. But actually, using ROV under partial deployment might cause control plane and data plane mismatch. And that means, well, consider the exact same scenario, except now the attacker is performing a subprefix hijack. Well, now AS2 receives two advertisements, and they are for different prefixes. One is for the /16, and the other one is for the /24. And therefore, it would forward both of them to AS3. Now, AS3 doing route origin validation would know to discard the attacker's route. And therefore, it would actually choose to take the correct path when sending traffic to 1.1.1/24, so for the subprefix. But once this traffic reaches AS2, in AS2's table, it actually says that this /24 prefix actually needs to be routed to the attacker. So since we don't have source routing on the internet, traffic will actually flow against the decision of AS3 and will actually reach the attacker. So the last thing that we've done in this study is to quantify these collateral damaging and collateral benefit effects. And in order to do that, we've used the simulation framework, which takes the internet graph as well as the inferred relations between ASs. And the simulations work as follows. So every time we pick one adopter and one victim ASs, and we assume that the victim has a ROA to protect its prefix. And then we pick some adopter set, a different one for each type of simulations that we're trying to do, and I'll show you a few later. And then we evaluate which of the ASs on the internet would choose to route their traffic to the attacker and which to the victim. So that would give us the attacker's success rate, which is sort of a measure of how good ROV is under this partial deployment. And we repeat that for a million victim and attacker pairs. So, so first off, let me start by saying by quantifying the security benefits that we gain by having these top ISPs adopt. So by top ISPs, I mean the ISPs on the internet ordered by the number of clients that they have. And here you can see two lines. So the green line means that every ISP adopts with probability, every top ISP adopts with probability 1, while the red line means that every top ISP adopts with probability 1/4. The x-axis means the expected deployment. So in order to compare these two lines, we really wanted to have the same size of deployments. So if you take the 100 point, for example, for the green line, that means that all the 100 top ISPs have adopted ROV, while for the red line, it means that out of the top 400, so not 100, but 400 top ISPs, each one of them had adopted with probability 1/4. And so these two deployment sets are expected to be equal, yet as you can see, there is significant difference between them. So while having a 25% adoption rate by the top ISPs does not substantially harm mitigate the attacker's the attack, while the subprefix attack is almost completely mitigated when the top 100 ISPs adopt. For the subprefix hijack, you can see the same trend. So really, again, the red line, well, in this case, almost does not move. This is precisely because of that collateral damaging effect. While the green line shows that the attack is diminished. Now, we have an online technical report. The technical report has some more details about these simulations and also includes some more data points. So and so you can see that at about 75% adoption rate, this gets very close to the green line, while at 50%, we're still pretty close to the red line. And then the last simulations that I want to show you compare between two scenarios. So one is today's status as reflected by our measurements. That's the red line. And that means that ASs that do not adopt, that we found that are not doing ROV filtering, continue not to do that. And while the green line suggests that all the top ISPs start doing ROV. The x-axis describes now the adoption rate of ROV filtering in the remainder of the internet. So x-axis at 1 means that actually everyone who we don't know to not do ROV start doing ROV. And so you can see really the tremendous effect of this collateral damage. So for the subprefix hijack, even if everyone adopts, it seems that a substantial amount of the internet would still get fooled and route their traffic to the wrong direction because of the collateral damaging effect caused by these core ISPs who we found to not perform filtering. Now, the green line, on the other hand, is actually quite optimistic. It shows that if we just get these 100 guys to adopt, well, that means that the attacker success rate is rather low, and it continues to diminish until 0 for that attack as more and more ASs adopt. So really, it seems like adoption by the top 100 ISPs or by the core of the internet can make a huge difference. And the bottom line that I really want to emphasize for these simulations is that it seems that enforcement by the top ISPs is both necessary and, very importantly, also sufficient to provide some substantial security benefits from the RPKI. So I actually view this as some very good news, because that means that focused effort and incentivizing these guys to adopt might actually provide some critical benefits. So let me just conclude my talk. So I've raised 2 issues regarding the RPKI. One is information accuracy, and to address that, we've presented raw alert, which informs and alerts operators about bad ROAs, loose ROAs, and inter-organizational dependencies. And also, I've talked about ways we can use the RPKI to prevent hijacks better. And we found that incentivizing ROV adoption by the top ISPs is actually very critical and is both sufficient and necessary for significant benefits. So with that, I'll conclude my talk, and thank you.
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom. Thanks for using real-life examples out of our RPKI. Could you please go back to the previous slide?
This one?
No, yes, that one. Okay, so on the loose ROAs, I wanted to make a little bit of remarks. I was around and in the room when the max length was kind of inserted. The previous design of a protocol had a single bit instead of it. And that was obviously much worse, because that enabled accept all more specifics. I guess you can agree that that would have been a really bad idea.
I certainly agree.
Okay, so kind of, I think the arguments why injecting the max length instead of asking people to enumerate exactly what they want to announce was based on the experience with customers that we asked to actually do in RPSL exact registration of all the routes they wanted to announce. And well, okay, some operators actually are pretty rigid on it, and we probably belong there, but we know that it's painful, and kind of the idea of giving people who really want to be a little bit lazy the choice of making them more vulnerable for having a little bit more comfort in doing the registry did seem kind of very much justified in the real world. And I'm quite sure that holds. However, the education to this and explaining if you do the ROAS for things you are not intending to actually announce, you are creating vulnerability, probably has to be emphasized more.
So thank you for this comment. I'd actually love to continue talking maybe offline about this max length property. We actually have some follow-up work on that, and I'd love to get your opinion. Yeah. Thanks.
For the inter-org stuff that you mentioned, I note that the design of the RPKI kind of mirrors pretty precisely the theory of how the internet addresses are allocated, assigned, and it seems kind of the only reasonable approach to keep that matching. However, the parts of the RPKI system that allow delegation, that essentially matches the delegation of the address space, is not really used a lot. Actually, right from the bottom, it's not used. Right from the top of the delegation tree, it's not used. And for the lower layers, there are only very few examples of delegation. And there are quite obviously some challenges of doing that. And then, of course, there is a lot of legacy problems. Not many operators have held a policy that for their PA space, actually portable assignments to customers cannot be done. Most people have some legacy there, and cleaning and dealing with that is just a pain.
So let me just say that I think that there is room for improvement in doing that. So of course, as you can see, our measurements indicate that the problem is not that big. The tree is quite shallow, as you point out. I do think that there is room for improvements in the ROAS. So in particular, our research paper also suggests a new thing called the wildcard ROA that might be able to completely remove these downward dependencies that I've told you about. I'd be very happy to talk about that during the break.
Okay, so let me stop.
Thank you.
Matt Petak, Yahoo, with hopefully an easy question. What are the top 100 ISPs? How did you define those?
Oh, okay. So we've simply looked at the ISPs in the internet topology. So CADA has this inferred business relations topology, and they're sort of inferring who is the customer of whom on the internet. So given this huge list of all ASs, we've sorted them by the number of customers that each AS has, and the top 100 of that list are basically the top 100.
You mean the size of the customer or just the number of customers?
The number of customers, that's what we've done.
So a customer with massive prefix blocks, that's only one customer, gets counted the same as somebody with a little tiny prefix?
In our account, yes.
Thank you for that clarification.
Sandy Murphy, Parsons. Could you go to the slide that's the pie chart?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, I probably, if I read that pie chart right, then there's like 16% of the people who responded said they employed RPKI in some fashion. I want their names. I want their home telephone numbers.
Well, okay, so I believe this result, as we also point that out in the technical report, is quite optimistic, and that is because the people who are likely to respond and the people who are likely to be on the mailing lists and forums that we've asked.
They were live. They were breathing. They typed on keyboards.
Well, excellent. Actually, I cannot give you their names because the thing is completely anonymous, but I'm very happy that you find this optimistic.
Right.
We also find some evidence that there are some people who are doing ROV. You can read the research paper about that.
Okay. Somewhat in joke, but it is interesting that there actually were positive responses. Let's see. About your interorganizational dependencies and finding out that people signed ROAs that disenfranchised their customers. Yes, this has been a noted problem for many times. At least 2 implementations, RIPE and Dragon Research Labs, when a ISP is signing their ROA, will say, do you know that you're invalidating the following routes in the routing table, and maybe you want to rethink that. So yeah, human error does come into play. Your collateral damage slides, you were talking about the one doing origin validation that only gets bad routes will be disconnected, but it's being disconnected from the attacker. If it wasn't doing origin validation, the traffic wouldn't be getting where it wanted to be getting anyway.
Exactly. So I try to say that. So if AS2 in that example was actually doing.
Yeah.
So if it was doing, then that damage would have been avoided. The damage is actually in AS2 not doing that.
Yes.
And
yes.
Yeah. So just
the second thing is the second collateral damage was because the control plane and the data plane were not in sync, and hands to those who thought that was a surprise. It's kind of a well-known problem. The final thing is there's a quote in the paper that I've seen that's of the same title. You say you expose a new security vulnerability. I would like to say most emphatically, this is not a security vulnerability in RPKI, and it's not a security vulnerability in origin validation. It's a misconfiguration by the operator, well-known, mentioned in the ops document. You quoted the ops document. It's something that's been known for a long time. Perhaps a bit of an overstatement to say you expose a new security vulnerability. All 4 of those things are, the ops document is about 5 years old.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you for that.
Okay.
So Warren Kumari Google, this might kind of be following on from what Sandy said, because I didn't really coordinate with her. But you sort of mentioned this, RFC 7115 sort of vaguely mentions the loose rower thing. The RF 7115 specifically actually points out, if you do this, you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. Unless the operator actually asks for that, don't generate the longer prefix. So yeah, that's information that people missed. But, to some extent, if you give people a powerful tool, they will shoot themselves in the foot until they learn that hurts, and then hopefully they'll stop.
Well, the RFC actually mentions that and says specifically that this attack is, you'd open yourself to an attack that's more likely to be sort of going out under the radar. I think it's very important to emphasize that this is actually more likely to succeed as well.
I suspect you might have I think I wrote some of that text. You might have misunderstood that. It says that it's more likely to be or it was meant to say, maybe it wasn't clear, is that if somebody manages to hijack the 16, that will be more likely to be noticed. It's possible that wasn't written very well.
I think that's the way it is. Yeah.
Sriram missed. Yes, RFC 7115 indeed makes that very clear. If you have a /20 and a /24, you should essentially, you only announce those 2 and no other more specifics. You should, it clearly states that you should try and issue separate ROAs for them that will provide the maximum protection from this forged origin attack. My other question is, when you do the collateral damage studies, you could do a sensitivity analysis with regard to the discard policy. So you can have 2 cases. One, you prefer invalid, and the other one, you discard invalid. It didn't look like you did the prefer invalid study, did you?
So no, this entire study actually focuses on the discard invalid. So what would happen if you would do discard invalid? Yes.
Yeah, I was just suggesting that to make it complete.
Right.
It might be useful to do a sensitivity analysis, consider both cases. What happens if you have a deep ref?
Yeah, I agree. We probably should do that. I think the reason we sort of didn't is because of this deep refer invalid would actually be completely vulnerable to subprefix hijacks. And I think when we've done that, we've chosen, because of that, we've chosen to focus. But I definitely agree. So it is interesting to show.
I just want to say, so we're going to close the mics. So Rudiger will be the last question, so we can get into to the break. Okay.
Okay, Rudiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom again. So let me close with a rare kind of positive comment from me. Your idea of monitoring and reporting on what's out there quite certainly is heading in a direction where we need to do a little bit more of work. For me, I have to say, I didn't respond to you guys sending our operations a report at some point in time. I'm fair. Well, okay, I didn't see much of an advancement beyond what the RIPE NCC is giving me daily. But kind of, I'm seeing actually a reason for diving a little bit deeper into what we actually should take as requirements for monitoring and reporting. I think there is actually a little bit more to be done, and to make it an important part of the overall infrastructure. Well, so thank you for pointing and going into this direction. I think there is a little bit more work.
Well, thank you very much for this comment. Yes, we are, at the end of the day, an academic team, and we definitely believe that there is much more to be done in that system and in that area.
Thank you so much. Thanks. That's great. Thanks.